So I think the BBC is in serious trouble. So President Trump threatens to sue the BBC for $1 billion in a defamation suit over allegations that it doctored footage to make it look like he incited violence at the Capitol Hill riots, and then they aired this footage the week before the presidential election.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and I'll be there with you, and we fight. We fight like hell. We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women.
And the problem, the way I see it for the BBC, is I think he's right. And I also think that the chair of the BBC might have made comments that have already drawn the conclusions of this case before it even gets started. So I'll explain why I think all of that in this video, but it's also spurred on lots of letters and various comments and things like that. So I'll talk about some of those also. So please do subscribe to the channel for more on this, and I'll be very grateful. So let's take a very brief look first at this letter here from Ed Davey. I'm not going to read the whole thing out, but one or two things which I'm going to pick out. He says here, the BBC's strength lies in its independence and impartiality. Now, a lot of people agree with that, and a lot of people do want that for the BBC and think that that's what the BBC should stand for. That is not to say that the BBC is without its criticism and, on occasion, ridicule. For example, I was reminded recently of this post from a couple of years ago, the BBC talking about, quote, transphobic comments from Melissa Poulton here of the Green Party. And the BBC, in this post here at least, to me appears very partial indeed, in that it is leaning in favour of trans people and against those making any comments referring to them as transphobic comments. And when we look at the article as well, this was in relation to Rachel McLean, accused of transphobic remarks. But then when we scan down the article and we just look at the subheaders within the article, the first one here, the Conservative Party's Deputy Chair for Women being accused of making transphobic remarks. But then when we look down at the other headlines here, it's gaslighting, vile and hateful, and there's no balancing subheader here. This is all really referring to, oh, without a shadow of a doubt, it's a transphobic comment, she said, Melissa said here. It's dog whistling at its finest, gaslighting does have an impact on people, etc. Of course, referring to this video here. And so the BBC, like I say, is not without criticism and, on occasion, ridicule. Coming back to Ed Davey's letter here, there is also a criticism I will make of this letter, where he says at the bottom here, and I quote, "We have watched with alarm as Trump and his allies have undermined the free press in the United States." Now, first of all, it should be President Trump. Whether you like him or not, you should respect the office. And that is a comment that I've heard a number of people use in the last few days. Regardless of whether you respect the person, you will respect the office. And onto the second page, Ed Davey says, "Will you join me in condemning Donald Trump's attack?" At least he used his first name this time. It should still be President Trump. "Attack on the BBC as political leaders with responsibility to protect the nation's most treasured institutions, etc." Now, I would respectfully suggest that in protecting the BBC, one should, as an MP, be fighting to ensure that the BBC remains impartial and does not air programmes which are quite clearly, in the opinion of many, misleading and perhaps even deliberately so. But I would respectfully suggest that if one wants to champion the protection of the BBC, especially if they're an MP, one should be fighting to ensure that it remains impartial and with its impeccable reputation, and that it doesn't get drawn into these kind of scandals, such as this one with President Trump, and even so much as not even quite an eye roll, but more of an exasperated eyebrow raised by Martine Croxall because she corrected pregnant people on the script to women, which I am fairly certain the vast majority of the population agree with. Even members of the trans community have written to me to say that they agree with it as well. And they don't want to be drawn into, quote, transphobic arguments and posts such as this one here. They don't want to be put in the same category. But as I say, these are just general points about the BBC. But let's go to the letter from President Trump, the threat to the BBC, and why I say I think they are in serious trouble. So this is the letter sent to the BBC on behalf of President Trump from Alejandro Brito. It says this firm serves as litigation counsel for President Donald J. Trump. It refers to the Panorama documentary, which was titled Trump, A Second Chance, which was first broadcast on the 28th of October 2024, a week before the presidential election. It says the BBC intentionally sought to completely mislead its viewers by splicing together 3 separate parts of President Trump's speech to supporters on the 6th of January 2021. The documentary showed President Trump telling supporters, "We're going to walk down to the Capitol and I'll be there with you, and we fight. We fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore." This fabricated depiction of President Trump was false and defamatory, given that President Trump's actual and full remarks were, "We're going to walk down and I'll be there with you. We're going to walk down any one of you, but I think right here, we're going to walk down to the Capitol and we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women." And I will make my own comment here and say that the major difference here is obviously he says we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women. Moreover, the letter goes on, the BBC edited out President Trump saying, "I know that everyone here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard." Thus, as set forth in an internal whistleblower memorandum, the BBC's segment maliciously made it appear that President Trump said things that he never actually said, by editing together footage from the start of the speech with a separate quote earlier an hour later. The fabricated statements that were aired by the BBC have been widely disseminated throughout various digital mediums, which have reached tens of millions of people worldwide. Consequently, the BBC has caused President Trump to suffer overwhelming financial and reputational harm. Now, I would pause from this letter for a moment and say to you that if you saw the original clip of President Trump, which made it look like he incited violence, then that would have given you an impression of President Trump, as many other tens of millions of people may have formed that impression, and that is what this letter claims here. So accordingly, under applicable law, this letter claims that the words are defamatory under Florida law when they tend to subject one to hatred, distrust, ridicule, contempt or disgrace, or tend to injure one's business or profession. And one of the reasons I think the BBC is in trouble is that there needs to be a mirror provision of law in the UK with the United States if they sue there. And there is. We have the Defamation Act of 2013, which, under Section 1, is a broadly similar provision. It says a statement is not defamatory unless its publication has caused or is likely to cause serious harm to the reputation of the claimant. And if it's a company, that's taken to mean serious financial loss. So very broadly similar statement. And in fact, it is somewhat easier to sue in the UK for defamation than it is in the United States, as you probably remember from my videos on the Johnny Depp trials a couple of years ago. But by the by, there just needs to be a mirror legal provision. And there is. So coming back to the letter claims that this was defamatory in that it was tending to cause hatred, distrust, ridicule, contempt, disgrace, injure, etc. So that, of course, broadly matches our serious harm element in Section 1 of the Defamation Act. And it gets even worse than that for the BBC, but back to the letter for just a moment. It says, consequently, the BBC lacks any viable defense to the overwhelming reputational and financial harm it has caused President Trump to suffer. The demands. The above-referenced false, defamatory, malicious, disparaging, and inflammatory statements were published to deliberately denigrate President Trump. The timing of the fabricated documentary is evident, i.e. the week before the election. The BBC's reckless disregard for the truth underscores the actual malice behind the decision. In the United States, they require actual malice, whereas here it is even simpler. It is just a defamatory statement and there needs to be a defense. But they say that this reckless disregard for the truth underscores the actual malice behind the decision to publish the wrongful content, given the plain falsity of the statements. And accordingly, President Trump hereby demands that you immediately issue a full and fair retraction of the documentary and any and all other false, defamatory, disparaging, misleading, and inflammatory statements about President Trump in as conspicuous a manner as they were originally published, so that everybody sees it. Secondly, immediately issues an apology. And thirdly, appropriately compensates President Trump for the harm caused. So why do I say that I think that this gets even worse for the BBC and they might be in serious trouble? Perhaps by their own admission. Let me take you to the letter from the BBC chair to the Culture, Media, Sport Committee. I won't read the whole thing to you, but I'm going to jump down to where it talks about the editing of President Trump's speech from January the 6th, which it aired in the Panorama program the week before the election. This in the chairman's words: "The editing of President Trump's speech on January 6th has attracted significant attention. The issue was the subject of discussion at the EGSC in January 25 and again in May 25. There was concern expressed by members of the committee, as well as Mr. Prescott, of the way the program was edited. However, the EGSC also heard from the BBC News that the purpose of the edit of the clip was to convey the message of the speech made by President Trump so that the Panorama's audience could better understand how it had been received by President Trump's supporters and what was happening on the ground at the time." Pausing there, that is perhaps the first admission, because it is again saying, and this might be an additional statement which may form part of the prospective lawsuit by President Trump. So this pink snippet of the chair's comments essentially says two things, which I think is damaging for the BBC. First of all, it makes a statement as to how they say President Trump's supporters had received his speech. It makes a statement as to how they received it. Secondly, it makes the admission that the editing of the clip was to convey the message of how they say the supporters received his speech. Bearing in mind that underpinning all of that would be the underlying message of the full sentence that they edited him to say, which was that they are going to go down to the Capitol and fight like hell. So it appears at face value to say that he was encouraging people to go down to the Capitol and essentially to riot, essentially to give rise to violence. So this pink bit here says that's how they say that his supporters had received the speech, and they wanted to tell people that. That's the first problem for the BBC, and I think that is a very damning problem. And this was put in a letter to this committee. But to me, that's not the most damaging part. The most damaging part is a little bit below it. And it sparked here in this letter after the discussion of complaints. He says, since the publication of Mr. Prescott's memo, this issue has led to over 500 complaints, the memo being the whistleblowing memo. He says, these are now being dealt with in the normal way. It has also prompted further reflection by the BBC. And this, I suggest, is perhaps one of the most damaging comments for the BBC. He says, the conclusion of that deliberation is that we accept that the way the speech was edited did give the impression of a direct call for violent action. I repeat, the chairman of the BBC's words, he says, the conclusion of the deliberation is that we accept that the way the speech was edited did give the impression of a direct call for violent action. The BBC would like to apologise for that error of judgment. Now, there's a really serious issue here. And I'm going to give credit absolutely where it is due to a senior learned colleague of mine, Colin Winter of King's Counsel, a prominent insurance silk and former insurance QC of the year. Colin makes the following observation, which I say is problematic for the BBC, to say the very least. He says, if the BBC does have defamation insurance, Samir Shah, the chair, hopefully cleared the text of his letter with those insurers, and then quotes the bit that I've just been reading to you. We accept that the way the speech was edited did give the impression of a direct call for violent action, which is essentially the main thrust of President Trump's threatened legal action, because that was inherently a defamatory statement because it's caused harm to his reputation because it was false. He didn't say it. Colin goes on to say, admissions can only be made with the insurer's consent. So, in other words, if the BBC does have defamation insurance, which I suspect that it does, those insurers will now be looking for a way out. And they might well say that the BBC, via its chair, has now already made a public admission which might see them lose this case before it even gets started. So they might say, well, we are not going to pay so much as a response to the letter. Perhaps, but that is why I say the BBC is in serious trouble here. And the letter concludes with its deadline and says, if the BBC does not comply with the above by 14th of November, which is in 3 days' time, President Trump will be left with no alternative but to enforce his legal and equitable rights, all of which are expressly reserved and are not waived, including by filing legal action for no less than $1 billion in damages. The BBC is on notice. Please govern yourself accordingly. And so BBC must respond. So to those saying that, well, this is in the United States, he can't sue someone in the UK, he can't sue a corporation in the UK, that is not true. That is only true if there is no reciprocal provision of law. For example, and quite ironically, in contrast with Ed Davies' letter about the BBC and freedom of speech and everything else, Ofcom has attempted to fine 4chan, the website in the United States, when not only is there not a mirror provision of law in the United States against publicizing certain things under the Online Safety Act, for example, there is quite the reverse. It is part of the US Constitution that they protect free speech. So for a UK regulator to try to sue a US corporation and its website against its own laws, that is just not going to work. So my prediction, they will not pay those fines. They will not entertain that lawsuit. And even if there was a lawsuit in the UK and they went along to the US and said, we've got this judgment, we want you to uphold it, the US courts will say, no, we're not upholding this because there's no mirror provision of law. And no court of the United States is going to uphold a lawsuit which breaches the First Amendment. The First Amendment being free speech. So I hope you found that interesting. Please do subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.